Hi, sweet beans. Welcome back to Wild Geese. I'm your host, Anna. Today, I want to talk about love. Happy almost Valentine's Day to all who celebrate. And if you don't, I understand you. I get it. It's kind of a fake holiday. Last year on Valentine's Day, I went on a third date with a guy and I was making fun of him for inviting me on a date on Valentine's Day. And we were joking that we were each other's Valentine. And this year we are still together and it's not a joke anymore. We are actually each other's Valentine. With that being said, I am not confining today's conversation to romantic relationships. I mean, if the shoe fits, wear it. But romantic relationships are just kind of a framing device that I'm using because I think that they're like a microcosm to our relationships at large and our ideas about love, like why it comes, why it goes, whether we're quote unquote worthy of it or not. These ideas ripple out into our creative lives and our value systems, and they affect the way that we show up in the world. Before we get into the meat of this episode, I just want to shout out the fact that I put out my first bonus episode on Substack, if you wanted to go check that out. I will be honest, I had a totally different idea for today's episode, but then I saw this string of tweets by Richard Sykin. And if you've ever seen a Richard Sykin tweet before, they have a way of making me be like, like I don't know, they're just always kind of weirdly profound, even though they're saying things that I've technically heard before. Anyway, this is what the tweet says. It says, "Love isn't a prize that we give to good people. Love is when two people make a good mix. Lots of evil people are deeply in love. And how would you earn love anyway? Do you earn it by performing the required tasks? Do you earn it by being good? If you've earned it, that means it's owed to you. Do we love people to pay off a debt? Why do I have to love you? Why do you have to perform to make me love you? No one deserves love. Love and worth aren't connected. Love isn't a reward for good behavior. It shouldn't be a treat people use to train each other." So there are so many reasons why I love this quote. I think it says something like at its base, very basic, but it's said in a way that kind of snapped me to attention. And I do think that there is a misconception that being partnered is like inherently virtuous in some way when that's like absolutely not true. One thing that it also makes me think of though is that really gross way of talking about people that's like, oh, she's a high value woman. He's a high value man. Or like when someone is single and dating, we say that they're on the market, like it's a marketplace of human beings. It's just a very transactional way of thinking and talking about love. We essentially make love into this numbers game and try to define our worth like it's a puzzle. But people are not problems to solve. And if you want a good problem to solve, I highly recommend diving into a math or a science course on Brilliant, which is the sponsor of this video. Brilliant helps you excel in math and coding with step-by-step interactive lessons and personalized practice. I've personally been loving their new Truth and Lies course lately to strengthen my deductive reasoning skills. It feels like a fun puzzle to solve on the subway. And every time I get a problem correct, the sound effects are just so satisfying to listen to. I think the UX is really well done. The courses are designed by world-class teachers from MIT, Stanford, and Harvard to serve anyone from ages 10 and up. I need a hands-on approach when it comes to learning math and science. I've never been able to sit there and listen to a lecture and really absorb anything that's being said, so I've found Brilliant's problem-solving games to be really helpful. To learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, click the link in the episode description or scan this QR code. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Happy learning. So if we can't sit down and define our worth like it's some math equation, that also means it's impossible to account for all of the variables that might keep us safe from heartbreak. And I think a lot of the times when people are really afraid of love and romantic relationships, that sort of thing, it's not even the heartbreak itself that they're afraid of. I think it can be the aspect of societal worth. Like if you've got a super avoidant person and they really like someone and they're like, I don't want to try out a relationship with that person because it might fail. We might get married and then get divorced. And that's not worth the risk to me. It brings up the question, like, if you're afraid of failure in romantic relationships, who are you failing? Is this a competition? If so, who are you competing against? Many people, especially women, are happier after divorce. If this was all about love, moving through it and then letting go of it when it's over, then of course we would grieve the relationship, but we wouldn't process it like it was a personal failing. The reason we process it like a personal failing is because we've got these concepts of love and worth so wrapped up in each other. We think it must say something about who we are as a person if a relationship ends or if it never begins in the first place, if we like someone and they don't like us back. So I think it's worth interrogating what makes a person quote unquote worthy of love in society's eyes. And I've come up with 3 things, and I'm sure that this is like a super reduction, this is a very nuanced conversation. I'm sure there's much more that goes into making up a person that society views as being worthy of love. But the 3 like big things that come to mind for me are, of course, how much money that person is making, how beautiful they are, and how innocent they are. The money conversation is, of course, a very important piece of this conversation. The economics of love is a really interesting thing to think about. It's not what I'm going to be expanding on today, though. The beauty part of the conversation, very interesting thing to think about. We're expected to suffer at the altar of beauty, yada, yada. Again, not what I'm really going to be focusing on today. I really want to think about innocence, though, and what happens when we treat innocence as a prerequisite for love. And I saw that Richard Sykin tweet around the same time that I watched People We Meet on Vacation, which is the Emily Henry book that was turned into a movie and put on Netflix recently. This is a book I read years ago, and I remember enjoying it at the time, but I had just read Beach Reads, and I remember thinking that Beach Reads was better. That's about all that I really remembered about it going into watching the movie. Still, it's always fun to see something that you've read and enjoyed be turned into a movie. I wish I would have had the habit of taking notes back when I read it a couple of years ago to understand more of what I was thinking about it then, because I definitely have some thoughts now. This story follows a woman named Poppy and a man named Alex who meet during college and make a pact to take a vacation once a year together after Poppy decides not to go back to school. So over the course of like 10 years or something like that, they're taking these trips. They're obviously falling in love on these trips, but they're also still dating other people, seriously and unseriously. The movie was fine. It was entertaining, but I was digital gardening as I was watching the movie, and I just found myself reflecting on how infantilized women often are in the love stories that we're consuming. Poppy definitely falls into the manic pixie dream girl trope, and I don't remember if it was as stark in the book as it was in the movie, but it was definitely like watching this woman who is so unaware of her friend's attraction to her, and she's just so unassumedly silly and innocent that Alex just can't help but fall in love with her. She's the quirky, unaware, unwanting woman. And of course, by the end of the movie, it becomes clear that this whole time she has had desires that she's been repressing. But the message that becomes internalized is that the desires need to be oppressed in order to maintain desirability. And this reminds me of the being kidnapped by One Direction trope that we were all like inhaling on Wattpad back in the day. I recently went to a birthday party that was fan fiction themed, so we all like took turns standing up and reading either fan fiction that we wrote or our favorite fan fiction or like just the most reminiscent fan fiction that we could think of. And someone read like the original Being Kidnapped by One Direction fan fiction that so many other fan fictions spawned out of. And it makes me think of that Sophia Azella quote from The Dull People that says, "A woman who doesn't want it is much hotter than one that does." Some of these stories were about being sold to One Direction, not just being kidnapped by them. And I will not lie to you, when I brought up this example when I was first recording, I was kind of like, hee hee ha ha, weren't we so silly, like reading these stories as kids? But it's undeniable that all of this is directly tied to rape culture, and I've periodically reflected with a lot of my friends over the years about the kind of stories that we were reading and how fucked up the fan fiction was, and I'm sure it still is. I'm just not really like actively a part of that world anymore. But like, yeah, you tell girls they lose some social value when they're not innocent, and not innocent in this case is as innocuous as being a fangirl. So the quote-unquote romance of the story naturally becomes, you don't like or want Harry Styles at all. You were forced into this situation, and then he kind of became your savior because he was nice to you. I'm not going to get too deep into the rape culture conversation because I don't want this episode to become super triggering, especially with all of the information about the Epstein files that has come out lately. But what I will say is that I think we know how puritanical ideologies can seep into the stories that we tell about love. I also want to be clear, though, that this is not a value assessment on people that enjoy these stories. I enjoyed People We Meet on Vacation when I read it years ago. I don't think that Emily Henry sat down and was like, yes, I want to write an infantilized woman. But I do think it reveals something true to us about what we think a good love story is. And of course, also, we've got an entire anti-aging industry that profits off of us wanting to look younger, maintain that innocent glow. Jessica DeFino on Substack has done some incredible work to break down the anti-aging industry. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but highly recommend reading some of her work. Ultimately, though, this is not just about making us feel like we have to strike this impossible balance between the innocent young girl and the perfectly grown woman. It's not just about denying our desires or looking younger. I think evaluating our worth by trying to measure our innocence sets us up for moral perfectionism and victim complexes. If we're constantly running from our shame because we believe that we need innocence in order to be loved, shame becomes a tool that we self-flagellate with or project out onto other people. This is why I have a hard time with people that are like complete people pleasers, totally conflict averse. When you're so afraid of looking like the villain in anyone else's eyes, that makes you dishonest. The user Chillbench on TikTok talks about this, and they said, at a certain point, I think we need to be emotionally mature enough to understand that you're gonna participate in harm in this lifetime, and you're not fully gonna be able to control it. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't care, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't try harder, and it doesn't mean that you're the victim. I have to participate in systems that I think are inherently violent and exploitative all the time. And I could reframe it to say that it is unjust for anybody to comment about something that I don't have full autonomy over. But that's a search for innocence, which is useless. I don't need clean hands. I need hands that are capable of helping other people. And they can't do that if I spend all my time wringing them over this idea that I'm a martyr because people have an emotional reaction to the harm in which I participated in and honestly benefited from. It actually costs me nothing to not justify my actions that harm other people, even if I cannot control them 100%. Oh my God, I honestly want to get, I don't need clean hands, I need hands that are capable of helping other people tattooed on my face. If we see innocence as a prerequisite for love, of course we'll play the victim when harm is done in order to outrun our shame. This is where crocodile tears come into play, like, well, I had to oppress you, so you pointing out that I oppressed you is actually hurting me, so I'm the victim. But I want to go back to what Caleb said about the search for innocence being useless. I think we cling to and value innocence because it's propped up as this, like, pre-shame place that we can burrow into. But unless you're literally a child, it's a myth. Like, it's just a delusion to think that we could actually move through this life with 100% innocence. But lots of people and societal expectations are kind of banking on this expectation that we will allow shame to control us instead of moving through it to arrive at a place of self-respect. I think a devotion to innocence is a control tactic, whether it's in our romantic relationships or in our strategies for community care. And I want to go back to the romantic relationship frame for this conversation for a second and use Unrequited Love as a little bit of an example. There's this Ask Polly essay called My Limited Experience with Love Has Been Totally Humiliating. And it's this person writing in, talking about having a crush on someone who ultimately ended up choosing and getting engaged to, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, getting engaged to their sister, and then feeling like super ashamed of themselves and embarrassed. And Heather Havrilesky, the author, writes, one of the saddest things about growing up in our culture is that we're taught to associate unrequited feelings with shame. We're taught to adore a God we can't see or feel. We're taught to love our parents and friends who often seem to underestimate or misunderstand us. And we're instructed to embrace the whole world even when it doesn't love us back. But when we love someone romantically and that person doesn't seem to feel the same way, that means we're pathetic and deluded. And I think this is a good example of shame being actually quite a shitty litmus test for whether something is right or wrong. We can feel ashamed of ourselves after having done nothing wrong because we've done something that ends up rubbing up against our own understanding of what makes us lovable to other people. Shame can sometimes show us where society's values diverge from our own. Like, oh, that thing that I just did, admitting that I liked someone before I knew if they liked me back, That goes against all of the messages that have told me that it's the more powerful, more lovable, more romantic position to be passive and coy and wait and see if the other person likes me first. The shame is not mine to hold. I can feel it and accept it because it's here, but I don't have to internalize it to mean something about what I'm worth. Because of course, two things can happen if you internalize that shame and make it mean something about how lovable you are, because you've like lost some sense of innocence by admitting feelings for this other person that didn't reciprocate. It can either like drive your self-esteem into the ground, or it can be deflected and like weaponized against the other person that didn't reciprocate your feelings in order to divert that shame. You could say that person is a horrible person and try to like turn all of your friends against them. I think that is what a victim complex would look like in this particular scenario, but it can play out in similar ways in all sorts of interpersonal relationships. Like, oh, I felt shame because of something I did, and I'm unable to process that emotion because I feel like it makes me less lovable, so I need to find someone to blame before I'm blamed. And if you're in unrequited love and then you make the decision to beg for the other person and they still walk away from you and you're left with a feeling of shame, then you have an opportunity to turn towards self-respect. And I saw something on TikTok that said, self-respect is not a feeling, it's a decision-making framework. And I was like, yes, that. And sometimes the decision-making framework of self-respect requires you to show up as a villain in other people's minds. And that becomes really hard to stomach when you hinge your whole idea of what makes you lovable around your own innocence. And this is why I say a devotion to innocence is a control tactic, even beyond our interpersonal relationship that shows up. Because if you look at activists that have made huge strides throughout history, they are most often largely hated at the height of their activism. Like, look at MLK. He might have a day dedicated to remembering him now, but people hated him when he was alive. Or Angela Davis, who was labeled a dangerous terrorist by Nixon for her work with the Black Panther Party. One thing that the bravest activists have all had in common is that they've understood that they did not have to hold on to innocence in order to do good in the world, and in fact, holding on to innocence would have stopped them from doing good in the world. But on an interpersonal level, a partner can say you're crazy for asking for your needs to be met. A boss can say you're hard to work with for standing up for a coworker. A family member can say that you should be ashamed of yourself because of your political opinions. When people start calling me difficult, angry, bitter, or just like willfully misunderstanding me, the knee-jerk reaction is to explain myself, to kowtow, to like sink in the shame that comes up. But self-respect as a decision-making framework requires me to widen my window of tolerance to disapproval and understand that I will not be awarded the prize of love because I maintained innocence in the eyes of everyone else. It's also just a rigged game to try to position yourself as this like innocent, perfectly consumable product, whether it's to a romantic partner or to the public, because society is kind of obsessed with punishing women, and we can spend our entire lives trying to outrun that. But that would make for pretty fearful small lives in the end. I think you can see what I'm talking about reflected in the public sphere all the time, and Rain Fisher Kwan talks about this as being womaned. And she expands on it in an article from ID that says, like wild animals and recycled plastic, women in the public eye have a life cycle that most of us know by heart. It starts with adoration. She lands starring roles, she writes hit songs, she goes viral, she's new and young and profitable. Then the idolatry begins. Maybe magazines start selling copies by calling her the voice of a generation or the next Marilyn or Eartha, even though she's barely college-aged. Maybe they'll label her a feminist icon because she went to a women's march. Maybe she gets too many fans too fast. Either way, she's well on her way to overexposure. The jokes that people found charming 6 months ago are starting to get old, and you're being force-fed her face through every algorithmic channel your phone can handle. And wasn't she always kind of annoying anyway? Now she's being discarded. Sometimes it'll be a rude comment on a rough day that pushes her off the pedestal. Sometimes it's a genuine mistake or wrongdoing, the response to which rarely seeks to genuinely or meaningfully address the problem at hand. It might be a mental health episode. Sometimes she simply receives too much praise, appears to have just a little too much power, and faces a wave of backlash for daring to be perceived as good at what she does. Most often, the public seems to just get tired of her. It's a system that builds women up into untouchable fantasies, just so we can watch in glee as the facade inevitably crumbles. It's a perpetual cycle of ritualistic idolization, degradation, and redemption that serves only to entertain the masses and generate profit for the powerful. She goes on to clarify that being womaned is not the same as being criticized. In an ideal world, one can be critiqued without being womaned. Conversely, women frequently experience the ritualistic humiliation, misogynistic abuse, and disposal I describe here without being meaningfully criticized at all. She calls this a total vibe-based hatred you see floating around. So this is when someone is like, ugh, I hate Jennifer Lawrence. And you're like, why? What exactly did she do? And they're like, I don't know. She's just really annoying, right? One thing she says that really hit me like a ton of bricks was this, though. She says, the ideal public-facing woman is a product with planned obsolescence. And I would argue that this is true for women at large, whether they're public-facing or not, if we're using innocence as a basis for worthiness of love. If we're saying you need to be innocent or you need to be a good role model of high moral upstanding in order to be worthy of love. In response to this kind of treatment, a woman named Ashanti on TikTok talks about becoming unpunishable.
Okay. It is really important as a woman to remember that even when you make mistakes, you have a right to your dignity. You also do not have to accept being degraded and humiliated by other people, by systems of power, on or offline. And I do think this is really important. When I talk about what it means to be an unpunishable woman, there are times that our actions, even actions we might not be proud of, when we make mistakes, that they will have consequences, right? Perceptions of us may change. However, that does not mean that you deserve, nor should you accept degradation, humiliation, unsafe behavior. Now, of course, when you're in the public eye or you're online and visible in any kind of way, this is amplified. People will have opinions. People will have things to say. That is what it is. And at the same time, you are a human being. You do not have to accept all of that kind of pushback that comes with it. And it's totally okay for you to still choose to protect your peace of mind. This is very important for women of all kinds, but particularly young women, right? We're living in a time where more and more women are coming online, more and more women are moving into industries where they are hyper visible. And therefore, the standard often of behavior expected is higher. Consequences that can come from being exposed are larger. All right, and things can go global, right? The behaviors that you may have done behind closed doors or done where you're only known in your local community now, if they happen, they are recorded, they are captured and shared, it can very much become global. However, that does not mean that you have to allow people to punish you. That's systems, whether that is social global communities to punish you. Everyone makes mistakes. And there'll be those of you who think that what I'm saying is that women should not be accountable, should not take responsible for their actions. No. Remember, an unpunishable woman is rooted. She's regulated, she's resourced, but she's not perfect. And in being rooted, it's about being honest within yourself about who you are, what your weaknesses are, and where, yes, you may have made mistakes. That, however, does not give other people the right to degrade you, to attempt to humiliate you in the face of those mistakes. History shows that systemically, there is a habit and a pattern of allowing, enabling, condoning, and facilitating men betraying their female partners. That is a habit and a pattern systemically. All right? So it's really interesting to see what is a push towards punishing, especially talking about someone's career being forever altered because of a mistake they have made. And that is not expected, nor is it enabled when it comes to men. We see many high-profile male figures go on to thrive in their personal and professional lives after publicly or privately betraying a female partner. So there's no need for this young woman's career to be forever altered because of one mistake that she has made. Remember, you do not have to allow people to punish you. Will there be consequences for our actions? Always. Yes, absolutely. But you do not have to allow people to humiliate you, to degrade you because of a mistake. It's not necessary.
But I want to bring this back around to the concept that we started with, that love is not a prize. It's not a treat to be gifted or withheld from another person based on good or bad behavior. If this is not what love is, what is love? I knew when I sat down to record this episode that Andrea Gibson was going to have something really powerful to say about this. And I was not surprised to find a poem that grapples with exactly what I'm talking about, called What Love Is. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the story behind this poem is basically Andrea's girlfriend's parents surprised them by coming to one of their spoken word shows. And the girlfriend's dad worked in fracking. And right before the show began, some protesters came asking them to announce a protest against fracking at the end of the show. Andrea's girlfriend is devastated and basically like, I understand that you have to say something. Andrea's like, it would go against my conscience not to. But their girlfriend is like, my dad has a job because of fracking. So Andrea goes through the show, and this is what happens. When I stepped on stage, her father was the first person I spotted. He was impossible to miss, a lumberjack in a forest of asymmetrical haircuts that looked even more asymmetrical next to her parents' straight backs, straight as telephone poles, and me, desperate for lines that could reach them. Resting the flyer for the protest near my feet so I could announce it near the end, I told myself, if you're gonna be anything in the world tonight, Andrea, you better be lightning. You better find something in you honest enough to strike them. For 75 minutes, I spoke about nothing but love. How everything but I love you is small talk. How their daughter was the only person in the world sweet enough to always call me honey. How the first time we shared a bed, she laid down with her arms tied at her side like a mummy, so terrified she was to love something and lose it again. When the show was near its end, I looked down at the flyer and back at them. I'd say the moment lasted a lifetime, but no one lives that long. I could see the protest organizers in the audience waiting. I could see their faith in my politics and what they were sure was about to march from my lips. Well, I remember the one tear that raced down my girlfriend's face, one tear with guts enough to hope, the look in her eyes when she ran into the green room belting, "They're here, they're here, they're here." I walked off stage without saying a word against drilling the heart out of the earth. I walked off to the green room a hypocrite, a failed activist with my face in my hands on the couch, when her father burst through the door, his head nearly axing a hole through the ceiling, tears like giant's tears covering his face. "I'm 76 years old," he said, "and I just tonight figured out what love is." There is no moral of this story. There is only light and sadness. There is no moral of this story. It's just a moment in my life where I did something wrong, and the earth, who has never not known what love is, held me anyway. So, this poem is really impactful to me because Andrea admits fault and still speaks of love. It's this acknowledgement that you will do harm. You will let people down. You will let yourself down. You already have. Abusers, I believe, are often born out of a refusal to admit fault. So we don't have to cling to our own innocence like they're these little coins that we can dispense in the love machine. And since Andrea passed, I've been reading their partner Meg's writing about going through the grief process, and she recently posted a piece on Substack titled "The Choreography of Care," where she's basically detailing the ways that her friends have been showing up for her, and she's been able to step out of the role of caretaker, which she took on when Andrea was diagnosed with cancer. She says, "What stuns me daily, what brings me to my knees, is how vastly I have oscillated from caregiver to receiver. This doesn't feel like a role reversal so much as proof. Love circulates. We take turns, offering, accepting. This is the choreography of care, the dance that never ends, only changes partners, changes who leads." So I guess that's it. That's one way to put it. Love is not a transaction, it's a dance, and you don't have to earn it. There will be times when we make huge mistakes. We don't have to accept humiliation and degradation in response to that. And we also don't have to stake our identity around being the victim in order to earn love. If you enjoyed this episode, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.